My name is Bruce Warshal, Brucewarshal, and today is January 27, 2017.
Welcome, Rabbi Warshal. I'm Miriam Sano-Dallin. I'm a professor of history and Jewish studies at Florida Atlantic University here in Boca Raton, and I'm an interviewer with the Boca Raton Historical Society and Museum. And this interview is being done for the Jewish Community Oral History Project. We're taping this afternoon on Friday, January 27th, 2017 at the television studios at Lynn University in Boca Raton, Florida. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you're you've had a long and illustrious career in Boca Raton as a rabbi, as a federation director, as a journalist. And I'd like to start by talking a little bit about where you were born and where you grew up and some of the early influences on your life. Tell us where you were born and where you grew up.
I was born in a little cold. By the way, I have a cold, so I'm sorry if I have problems with my voice today. But I was born in a little coal town in Pennsylvania called Pittston, Pittston, between Wilkes-Barre and Scranton, Pennsylvania. Everybody knows that area because our vice president came from Scranton. Mm-hmm. It was a small, we were only 60 Jewish families, and practically no children. They were older. They were merchants on the main street in this little town. Mm-hmm. And I was the only Jew in my class in school from first grade through 12th grade. And it was not a sophisticated background at all, you know.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about your parents. What were they like? What did they do?
Well, my father was a businessman. He had a store on Main Street. That's how they got to that city. My mother was born. He was born in New York, but he was brought as a young person into the coal regions. As you know, Jewish history. When my grandparents came in, my Zaidi came into New York. My Zaidi and my Bubby worked in the sweatshops in New York. And then they migrated, the Jewish communities migrated into all the little towns of Pennsylvania, Reading, Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, Allentown. That was the next step out of the Jewish ghetto on the Lower East Side. Mm-hmm. And they were small merchants.
And many became storekeepers.
Many became storekeepers, exactly. And my mother was a stay-at-home mother. Later on, she worked in the business with my father as well. And I had a wonderful family. We were conservadox Jews, conservative towards Orthodox, because there was one little shul for everybody. And in fact, until I was really an adult, I was always told there were three kinds of Jews. There were the Orthodox, the conservative, and the Goyim, because it was a very traditional community. They didn't. Nobody knew liberal Jews at all, but it was a warm community. And it was a comforting place to grow up. And
Did you know your grandparents?
I was very close to my grandparents, to my mother's parents. My mother came from a family of 8 children, and it was a clan. I was close to not only my grandparents, but all of my aunts and uncles. Every Sunday, we went to my grandparents' home in Scranton, which was around 10 miles away. And in fact, my grandfather, my Zaidi, lived until 97, and I'll never do this again. I was the rabbi who officiated at his funeral, and I couldn't control myself. I was that so close to him. Mm-hmm. A doctor who doctors himself is not wise, as you well know, and you shouldn't do that.
What year did he die? Do you remember?
Sometime in the 80s. I can't give you these. He's lived until 97. Mm-hmm. My mother lived till she was 100. God willing, you can't tell. Maybe I'll make it. I'm only 80 now, so I have a good 20 years left. And that's very important, by the way, that I was close to my grandfather, because I feel as I'm an immigrant, my roots are in the immigrant community. I was part of the American community, obviously, but I was always an outsider in that sense, psychologically. The only one of my... Now, there was no real great anti-Semitism against me. I looked at my yearbook. I was vice president of my junior class, so they couldn't have been anti-Semitic if I was involved in the class. But I always still had an outsider's viewpoint, and I think that's very, very important. Problem is, my children are so part of the grandchildren are so part of the establishment of America. They got to get a little distance if they're going to have. As a historian, you understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you know where in Europe your father was born? Actually, in Europe,
New York,
but he was brought as a child. You
Yes.
said where in Europe were his
Well,
parents from?
I know where my maternal grandparents were. My grandmother, my bubby, was born in a small town in Poland, whose name I do not know at this point. But my grandfather was born in Vilna Gubernia, which is the part of Vilnius today, but not in a little village right outside, in a suburb, a little village outside of Vilna. Yes, Vilnius.
Well,
They were Eastern European Jews, and that's the other thing. I came to the United States. I never knew a German Jew until there were no German Jews in our little shtetl. They were all the Eastern European immigrants. Yes.
Did you speak Yiddish at home?
My parents, that's the sad thing. My parents spoke Yiddish when they didn't want me to know. They never passed it along to me. I mean, I know Yiddish phrases. I know words in Yiddish you don't want me to put on tape today, but I'm not a Yiddish speaker. I learned Hebrew to become a rabbi, but Yiddish is not part of my background. The Yiddishkeit is part of my background, but not the actual Yiddish language, and I resent that to this day. I'm not resented. I'm saddened about that.
But when your grandparents spoke among themselves, I assume
They spoke Yiddish. And they spoke English too, but and as my grandfather and grandmother got older, they spoke more and more Yiddish. That's the way it happens very often. Mm-hmm. So I understand Yiddish to an extent, but I cannot speak it.
Are there any words or expressions that you remember that particularly stand out to you that they used to use or you used to remember hearing?
No, just it's just I feel comfortable in a Yiddishkeit kind of environment.
How do you remember celebrating the holidays when you were growing up? Passover,
yeah.
Hanukkah.
We kept a kosher kitchen, my parents, but they ate out. That's the typical assimilation. And I always tell people who keep kosher kitchens, but they eat out, that means that the dishes are going to heaven. I mean, what's the value? But that's the first step from being totally committed to, and so on. We had seders, and we went to shul. We didn't go to shul every Shabbos, but we went to the high holy days. My father was, in fact, in this little town, this little congregation of 60 Jewish families. My father at one point was president of the synagogue and so on, the shul. It was culturally a Jewish family, and there's another Jewish element that was involved. People don't think of it as Jewish, but my family was liberal. My father was a very great liberal. He told me stories of remembering his father taking him to a rally for Eugene Victor Debs. Okay, that was a great memory of his. And around our dinner table, we discussed politics. In that sense, it was an intellectual thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, no music. I didn't know what classical music was until I went to college. I took a course in music appreciation. I happened to love classical music this time. It was not a cultured environment in the sense of the arts, mm-hmm. but in the sense of politics and ethics. Mm-hmm. For instance, as a reaction, as a historian of the Jewish community, you know this well, but maybe somebody who's listening to this tape doesn't know it. As a reaction to the anti-Semitism against the Jews created a superior reaction, like, well, they don't have a Yiddish kop, the Christian, mm-hmm. meaning they don't have a Jewish intelligence. Yiddish kop means a Jewish head. Right. I'm translating for the tape. And I remember my father sitting me down. I was a youngster, and said, don't ever use that expression because Christians are just as smart, if not smarter than us. All human beings are smart. That's a prejudice against somebody else. If they're going to be prejudiced against us, you don't have to be prejudiced against them. So that was the environment that I grew up in. And that's, I tell people I was born a Democrat and I only became a Jew 8 days later. you know. But that was the environment that I grew up in.
So Eugene Debs was the first socialist candidate for president.
And not only that, he got 1 million votes. I guess it was in 1920 for president. I mean, he didn't get one electoral college vote, but 1 million people voted for him. Mm. He was a great man, and this crazy socialist, everything he wanted ended up in the New Deal. So ultimately, they won, which is good. I mean, I live on socialism. It's called Medicare. I'm very happy.
What year were you born, by the way?
I was born in 1936. I'm 80 years old right now.
And what was the name of your congregation? Do you remember?
In my little coal town?
Yeah.
Anshe, wait. Hold on. Geez, you see that? Age sets in. No, Agudathachim. It was Agudathachim. Mm-hmm. Okay, the congregation of brothers, it's translating. Agudathachim, yes.
So what presidential elections do you remember growing up?
All of them. I mean, I first voted, I would have voted for Stevenson in '56 because I was over 18 but under 21, and that time you had to be 21. So the first time I actually voted was in 1960, although I was very much in favor of Stevenson as a youngster and so on. Mm-hmm. Remember that this was the blacklist period, the McCarthy period during the 50s. I came of age during the McCarthy period, and I voted for Kennedy. That was the first one. Yeah.
You talk about that a great deal in the articles you write today about the McCarthy days and the days of the witch hunt. Tell me a little bit about those days as they affected Jews, as you remember them, in your personal experience.
That's very interesting. Growing up in the coal regions, which the coal regions were anti-Semitic. There's no doubt about it. I often said in the South they talked about damn Yankees. Well, in the coal regions it was dirty Jews. It was the same kind of a reaction. But I didn't have a lot of personal anti-Semitism against me. I had a lot of friends in high school and so on. In fact, just yesterday I have a friend, a liberal Catholic friend, who I drove over to Naples. We had lunch together with he and his wife, and then I drove back with him and his wife, and I drove back. And I have close friends going back to high school, Christian friends, because that's all I had in the high school were Christians. So I didn't have any personal anti-Semitism. My argument against McCarthy was the idea. It was more intellectual. That you couldn't speak out. I always spoke out. As a youngster, I got my ethical basis from my mother was liberal, but my father molded me, and I didn't have to find liberalism. It was always within my family, and the speaking out was not necessarily always in my family because those were still the days where you were shasha Jews. Don't make too many. Don't cause too many problems out there. I never adhered to that. I don't know why. Maybe it's just my personality. Mm-hmm. I have no idea. And later on, we were in the civil rights movement. I just wrote an article about that for Martin Luther King Day, mm-hmm. But it predated those days. When my brother and I were first generation college educated. My father was not college educated. And he always wanted his children to be professionals. So he said, "You got to be an attorney. You have to be a lawyer," which I eventually did become a lawyer before I became a rabbi. And he said, when I was 18 or so, I was like a freshman in college or so, and he said, "If you're going to come back to town," little did he know I wanted to get the heck out of town and get to a larger environment. Mm-hmm. He said, "You should join the Masons because they're a very powerful organization in town, and they do accept Jews, and you make contacts, and if you go early in life, you can't be blackballed, because who could blackball an 18-year-old? There's no history to be mad at him." And he says, "Join." So I joined. And I went through the first things. I read, you start and they tell you all their secrets. And then I read the charter. And it said, for white males. And I looked at that again. I was 18 years old. And I said, I'm never going to be. I refuse to be a member of an organization that discriminates against blacks. And I dropped it. Now, I don't know where that came from. That came from my upbringing. It came from my Jewish upbringing.
Was there a rabbi in your shul that influenced you?
There were many rabbis in my shul. The problem is when you're an unaffiliated conservative shul, we didn't belong to any other thing because we were too small and they're saving dues and money. We got rabbis either going up or coming down. You go to the Jewish newspapers in New York and look for a rabbi who is advertising to get a job, and some of them were good and some of them were bad. We had a very intelligent young rabbi, Rabbi Meza, Gabriel Meza, who was Jackie Mason's brother. And the funny thing is, he talked just like Jackie Mason. Yes, it's good to be here on Rosh Hashanah. And he was an interesting guy. That's the family. He was a good, serious rabbi. Didn't inspire me, but he was good. And he stayed a couple years and then went on. He was one of those coming up. There was another rabbi whose name escapes me right now, who inspired me because he taught me how to dance the hora and so on, So, but I wasn't inspired by rabbis as such. I was no one rabbi at that age inspired me. Later on, I was inspired by many other rabbis, like Rabbi Lelyveld of Cleveland, Ohio, famous rabbi who went down south and got his head bashed in, and Rabbi Joachim Prinz from New Jersey. In fact, he spoke right before Martin Luther King at the rally in the March on Washington in 1963.
Were you at that rally?
I was there. My wife and I were at that rally. Absolutely, yes, because I was involved. I was vice president of CORE at that time, Congress of Racial Equality. That was one of the cutting edge civil rights movements to the left of Martin Luther King. To be on, don't tell anybody this, but we thought of Martin Luther King as an Uncle Tom. He was more conservative than us. He was a great man, obviously, in history. But so I've been inspired by rabbis, and that was my inspiration to go into the Reform movement. And later on, when I wanted to become a rabbi, I wanted to help humanity, social action rabbis. Today we're into spiritualism, which is very good. Mm-hmm. But I always tell people, if you really want to feel spiritual, join a picket line. Join a picket line. You'll feel spiritual helping other people. And I was inspired by the Reform movement. Was a cutting edge of social action at the time, in the late 50s, early 60s. And so I was inspired by rabbis. And I always wanted to become a rabbi. And when I made the decision to leave law and go into the rabbinate, I gravitated to the Reform movement for that reason.
Tell me about how you got involved in the civil rights movement, because it seems you did that very early when you were in college, and also how you went to college.
Yeah. How I went to college. Okay. My father's business was going bad when I was in. He had good times and bad times. When my brother, who's 6.5 years older than I, when he went to college, they had money, and my brother chose to go to Bucknell University, a very fine small school in Pennsylvania, all-line school. And but when I came back 6 years later, we didn't have money at all. What happened is my father was in the clothing business at the time, Army and Navy kind of clothes stores, which don't exist anymore, sort of lower end, less expensive. And in the 50s, that was the rise of the Kmarts and the discount houses. And basically, they put all of the small lower-end stores out of business. So his business began to plummet immediately once you had these big stores come in, the Walmarts and the Kmarts and so on. And there were others at the time, too. Zayers was another one, if you remember that. Jewish-owned store. And So I could not, I didn't go away. I commuted to a small school, Wilkes College, now it's Wilkes University, in Wilkes-Barre, 7 miles away from my home, because I didn't have any higher horizons. I wasn't sophisticated enough to say, hey, maybe I should apply to one of the great schools and they'll give me money and so on. All I knew is that Wilkes was there, and it was a good little school, and I commuted to Wilkes. In fact, for the first year I didn't have a car. I took a bus or hitchhiked. Most of the time I got a ride hitchhiking. In those days you could hitchhike. And I got an excellent education there. I was a tremendous debating team, and debating partners. There was a lot of young kids that didn't have money who were bright, as it turned out. And I did well there. I did well enough that when I decided to go to law school, I applied to Harvard and Yale and Columbia and Pennsylvania, to good law schools, and I got into Yale. And I got into U of P. I chose Yale. Never got into Harvard. It really bothered me. I'll tell you why. First of all, Yale's a better school. That's not the point. Yale had 150 spots. It's a very small elite school. Harvard had 550. It's a big school. Now, I don't know how I get into Yale and not Harvard. They just don't have they have absolutely no taste up there in Boston. I'm telling Cambridge. I'm telling you that. And that's when I went away to a big fancy school.
So what year did you start Yale Law School?
I started Yale School in 1958. Now, I was an undergraduate economics major, and I loved economics. Didn't want to become an economist as such, but I loved economics. So I stayed, instead of 3 years, I stayed 4 years there, and I split my 2 middle years between the School of Economics and the law school. So I also got a master's in economics from Yale. And I did well enough there that while going to, I went up to Yale. They gave me a lot of money, but they didn't give me money to live on. They gave me all the tuition and stuff and so on. Otherwise, I couldn't have gone unless they offered me a lot of money. And so what I did is I was a dishwasher at lunch. I washed dishes for the lunch, and they gave me 3 free meals. I was a waiter in the evening at a local Italian restaurant. I had to work. I was up there because I had to live. My parents did not have the money for me to, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. And undergraduate school, I worked 40 hours a week when I was going to undergraduate school as well.
What did you do?
I did everything. I'm telling you, your tape isn't long, we don't have enough time to tell you all the jobs that I had. But I worked, and it's good. And the more the times that I worked, the hardest is the times I made my best marks. You have to be disciplined. It taught me discipline. My life history taught me discipline, and my college education and Yale taught me how to think. That's different than discipline. Taught me other things. And while I was up at Yale, I got married in my third and fourth year at Yale. I was going with my wife. She was a high school senior, and I was a college freshman when we met, and we dated for 5 years or so. And I married, and then those last 2 years I was teaching economics at Quinnipiac University at the same time I was going to law school. Because
how did you meet?
Jewish Community Center in Wilkes-Barre. We met there. Yeah. And it was Wilkes-Barre had an active 5,000 Jews. There was a beautiful Jewish community, many synagogues. Today they're down to 1,700. It's all of those. The children moved out into the big cities, to Philadelphia, to New York, and so on. But that was an active Jewish community, and it was very, very good.
Tell me how you got involved in the civil rights movement in the Corps.
Okay. Well, I obviously had my beliefs as I go back to when I was 18 and the Masonic Temple and so on. I had a very close friend in Yale Law School who was African American. And he said that they're having a sit-in in the South, and he was involved with CORE. And I said, really? Tell me about this organization.
What does CORE stand for?
Congress of Racial Equality. The leader was a very good guy called Jim Farmer. He was one of the really pioneers in civil rights, and everybody has forgotten him. You know how people work, and some people are remembered and others are forgotten. and he was a good man. And they were having we sat in Maryland. The only time in the South that I sat was in Maryland. Maryland was a very segregated, exceedingly segregated state. You would think people today think of Maryland as a northern state. It isn't. It's a southern state. Although it never belonged to the Confederacy, it was a southern state. And what they were doing is they were integrating Route 1 from Washington up to New York, because it was an embarrassment when foreign dignitaries would come in, blacks from Africa and so on. They couldn't eat if they were going from Washington to New York. There was no place for them to stop. They couldn't use restrooms. They couldn't do anything. It was typical South. And we sat in down there, and there was a big movement. The whole group, we started in the northern end and ended up in a African American church in Baltimore. It was a rally in the evening. And only one time during that time, I thought I was really afraid for my life, just at one point. But fortunately, as I recently wrote in my article, it wasn't Selma. It was Maryland, and the Maryland state troopers got in and sort of saved us. It was that much more civilized than the deep, deep South. And then when I graduated as a lawyer, I was recruited out to Cleveland, Ohio, where, again, by the way, I was recruited. I didn't go to law school to go to Wall Street. I went to law school to become a labor lawyer on behalf of the unions. And I went with a firm that only represented a small firm, was basically a Yale firm. That's the reason they recruited me. They went back to their alma mater. And we represented only liberal unions, the steel workers, the auto workers, and other liberal unions. And I did most of my work for the auto workers. And when I went to Cleveland, we were forming a core chapter there, and I ended up vice president of that core chapter. Cleveland was a terribly segregated city. You don't realize the North was, not by law, but by tradition, and we integrated hotels. We integrated St. Luke's Hospital was not integrated. We worked on all of those things, and so I was very much involved in civil rights in Cleveland as well. And then after practicing for 2 years there, because I became a lawyer because my father wanted me to become a lawyer. I hate to say it. I was a good Jewish boy. And then I decided I really want to go I said, I want to see if I can be a rabbi. If I go and it's not a good experience, then all I have done was deepen my Jewish experience, my Jewish knowledge. If I go for a year or two and I feel maybe I should go back to law, it's not, they wouldn't have been lost years. They would have been learning more about my own heritage and my own religion. And my wife and I picked up, we were in Cleveland, and we went down to Cincinnati, where that's the home base for Hebrew Union College. It's only one of 4 campuses, but that's the mother campus.
That's a seminary for the Reform.
It's a seminary for the Reform movement, right. If you want to be a Reform rabbi, you go to Hebrew Union College, either in L.A., Cincinnati, New York, or Jerusalem. And we spent 5 years there, and that's how I went from the law. I still practice law on the side. I was a lawyer for one of the Great Society retraining programs. I had to make a living. At that time also, when I was going full-time to the rabbinical seminary, I was teaching economics full-time at Miami University of Ohio.
I want to go back a moment to the sit-in, because people watching might not understand what that involved. First of all, that was the early 60s that you did that.
That was the early 60s.
Do you remember what year around?
No, the sit-ins, yeah. It was 60, 61, and that right around there.
Were you integrating lunch counters or
integrating restaurants?
And what would you do? What did you do physically?
Well,
what happened?
we broke up into groups of whites and blacks, so it is an integrated group. And we would go into a restaurant and sit down. And the only time, by the way, that I felt threatened is one of the restaurants we went in was basically a bar. And there were a lot of, I don't know whether rednecks is a pejorative term or not, but a lot of people not friendly with us sitting at the bar. And that was scary when I sort of was getting up and they're coming towards us. I figured that's when the state troopers walked in.
I have
Now,
to ask, why was that dangerous?
it was dangerous to me because I thought there was going to be physical attacks. I mean, I think they were coming to pick us up, and physically, I don't think they would kill us, but I didn't want anybody. I mean, they were hefty truck drivers, kind of. I mean, they were, you know, I don't want to, this is a prejudice too, lots of tattoos. You know, I mean, I didn't want to, I know, that scared me, but that's the only time I really was in danger.
It was against the law or custom for black people to sit at the
Yeah,
restaurants or
black
at the
people
counters.
sit at the restaurant. They didn't allow it. They didn't allow that. And, well, I don't know whether it was technically against the law, but the restaurant had the right to stop you. Okay? Now, then what happened is they could not evict us under Maryland law at the time until some official policeman came in. I don't know whether it was the city or state troopers had to come in and say, here's the law, trespassing. If you don't get up and walk out, you're going to be jailed right now. And we didn't go to jail. What we did is we got up, walked out, and went to the next restaurant. And then another group, there was a whole group, there was like, would come in and sit at that restaurant. So we closed down all day every restaurant on the whole highway. That was the intent of that sit-in. And it brought a lot of attention to the problem and was part of the thing that's helped change a very small part of the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. I'll be honest with you. I mean, I got more out of my participation in the civil rights movement than I ever gave to it. In Cleveland, I did a lot more. Cleveland, we really did some. We protested building of more segregated schools because when they were placing their schools, they should have placed them in areas where they would have been integrated. We laid down in front of bulldozers to stop the construction. Sad to say, one of our members was killed. A bulldozer ran right over him.
Wait, you lay down in front of...
No, I didn't. No, we did as a group. I never went to jail for a reason. I was the only one to get him out. We didn't have any other lawyer in the group. You know, but we were very, very active. We were active, and we were called. The daily newspaper, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, called us communists. When we used to go to a core meeting, the anti-subversive unit of the Cleveland Police Department, they actually had an anti-subversive unit that coordinated with the FBI. And, you know, and they would come and take our license plates. They knew us to show that we were there, and I mean, our phones were tapped. We knew that. I mean, we were looked upon as communists. This was Cleveland, a northern city, and we went down. We got to the Great March in August of '63 because we, as a group from CORE of Cleveland, we hired a bus and we went down all night. I didn't go alone, but my wife and I went down to Washington, and that's where I heard the great speech, I Have a Dream speech, and Joachim Prince's speech right before. And that's the speech, by the way, that Joachim Prince said. And it was a really great speech. It was eclipsed, obviously, by the I Have a Dream speech, where he talked about his experience as the chief rabbi of Berlin, or the chief reform rabbi of Berlin, anyhow. And he said the sin of the people in Berlin was not prejudice, was not this, was not that. It was silence. Silence. You can't remain silent. And that was his big thing there. And I've never remained silent in my life. I'm the pain in some people's neck. Yeah.
What's the main thing? Is that the main thing you remember from the 1963 March on Washington where Martin Luther King spoke?
Okay, this is an 80-year-old thinking back. It was a good feeling to stand up for civil rights. It really was. I remember, obviously, his speech, And it was just gestalt. The whole thing was just, and we were, if we're going to be called communists, we may have well enjoyed it. And we did. I mean, nobody feared for their life. It was a joyous day. It was like the march, it's like we're doing it the same week after the Women's March on Washington, right after the installation. It was a joyous day.
Donald Trump, you're talking
Donald Trump.
Trump.
We're Donald Trump now, yes. Okay.
So let's bring it up to the 60s and the late 60s. You were when were you in Cleveland? What years were you?
2 years in Cleveland, full time, 62 to 64. And then I went down to Cincinnati for 5 years, and then I went to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I was the rabbi of it was my student pulpit the year before, only 60 families, and I was up there for 6 till 75 for six full-time years, and we built it up to 200 families. And at that time, I was late 30s, 40 years old, late 30s actually, and I had a part-time cantor because we were a small congregation. We had a student cantor, and we had a part-time director of education and a part-time director of youth groups and so on. And I wanted staff. And looking back, I was probably, quote, ambitious. So I left that congregation, and it was a love affair. It was a great congregation, and I was chosen as the rabbi of Touro Synagogue in New Orleans, Louisiana. Touro was an all-line, founded in I think 1840 something, all-line Southern Reform congregation. It was classical reform. I am not classical reform.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You were well known as a civil rights leader. You were a member of CORE.
Yeah.
You were outspoken.
Right.
How did you get a job in New Orleans at a Southern?
Well, that's interesting, because by that time, by 1975, the civil in New Orleans, not in the South, but in New Orleans was a relatively liberal city for the South. First of all, history will show that New Orleans never voted to go into the Confederacy. It was the rest of Louisiana that went. New Orleans they were interested in making money and drinking, okay? Maybe drinking and making money in that order. It's a decadent city. And the Catholic Church, which dominates the city, was very liberal on integration. And the Jewish community was just as happy to be into that I gave them no problems politically at all. They were probably all just as liberal as I am on integration and generally on things, okay? I'm sure there must have been some conservative economic people, conservative, but not socially conservative. And the problem in New Orleans was that they were a classical reform congregation. Now, you know what classical reform Judaism is, out of a German background kind of thing. For the tape, I should say, for the people who are watching this tape, they were great assimilationists. They were anti-Zionist. I put the Jewish flag when I went down there in the sanctuary, and a week later it was taken out, and they said, "Rabbi, that's the flag of a foreign nation." Well, Israel is a foreign nation, but the Zionism, at that time, I mean, there was nobody that even had any criticism of Israel. There's no reason for it. It was a young, and they said, I was so dumb I didn't ever even ask this. When I took the congregation, after all, it was a big congregation, 700 families at the time, with a building, the dome, which was built in 1907. It's a historical building and so on. Never asked them. I just thought Judaism is Judaism. When I got down there, they said, "Rabbi, you put that beanie on your head and you're fired." So my problem down there was not political, not even ethical. It was ritually. They wanted to, and I wanted to make them cool. I was hired by a lot of young people on the search committee. But when I got down there, I realized that they didn't control the congregation. The people in their late 70s and 80s who owned the congregation on the board, they didn't want to change.
And in classical reform, it wasn't the custom to cover the head or wear prayer shawls.
No, it wasn't custom. Yes, let's get that for the tape. There was no covering of the head. Now, there's no magic in covering of the head. It's a relatively new tradition within Judaism. If you look at the Shulchan Aruch in the early 1500s, no mention of it. You read Maimonides, no mention of it. In other words, it's relatively late. It's 300 or so years. I mean, ancient Jews in Israel did not walk around with kippot, with yarmulkes, all right? But it's it's just another tradition, and it's no sin if you want to pray without a head covering. But it's that they wanted to be so non-Jewish, and they were tough years for me. And I stayed there 3 years, and I said, I'm not having fun. So I also had a very difficult president who said, Rabbi, you're causing too much activity. Never had a president told me that. He says, you're ruining my budget because you have all this adult education stuff going on, and our light bill is sky high, and the maintenance men, we have to pay so much overtime. Just do Friday night and Saturday morning. That's all I want. And I said, that's not the kind of rabbi I am. I'm here to build a community. So I felt it was better I should get out.
So that's around the time you came to Boca Raton.
Exactly. I left New Orleans, and I decided, I was tired after battling, and I decided to take a job in Federation, where not only that, I would have my own, each Shabbos would be my own. I didn't have to work on Friday night and Saturday morning. Federation director, I could have my own Shabbat dinner every Friday night. I can go to my shul here, although I ended up having a part-time congregation because I can't give up my identity as a rabbi for 29 years.
Tell us something about what the Federation is, how it got started. Why was it an area that you wanted to go into? What is a Federation exactly?
Okay. The Federation, the Jewish Federation movement started in the 1880s and 90s, and it started to they had all these different organizations, the synagogues, the this, the that, the that, and it was started as a panoply organization to raise money to support the soup kitchens, the Jewish soup kitchens, and all the thing. It was just, the only way I describe it to non-Jews as sort of the counterpart of Catholic charities. You raise money and you help people. In the case of you create a Jewish family service, or the family service is there, and you give them money so that they can help people in need, and so on. And when the Jewish Community Center movement started later on in the 20s and 30s, although there were other settlement houses that were earlier, sort of prototype Jewish community centers, they got money from the Federation. And then when the Zionist movement arose, the United Jewish Appeal, UJA, that was totally separate from Federation. They were two, as you well know as a historian of American Jewry, and they were raising money not to help all the local organizations, but they were raising money to send to Israel. The two movements eventually coalesced and joined each other. So it was Federation, UJA, somewhere in the late 30s. You can probably give me that date. I'm not sure the exact date. I'd have to look it up. Mm-hmm. So the federations existed to raise money for local Jewish organizations and for Israel combined. And then there's always the tension. How much money do you send to Israel and how much money do you keep home? That's an internal tension to this very day. Less so today because Israel doesn't need that much money these days. They need Jewish support, but they don't need money. They're a prosperous country, thank God. So that when I came to Boca Raton, there was only one federation in West Palm. There were no Jews in Boca Raton to speak of. Today there's 50% Jewish, the city. For Boca, and the last time I looked at the statistics, for Boca and Del Rey combined, because that is the Jewish Federation takes in two cities, from the ocean to the Everglades, there are about 135,000 Jews. And there's only about 260,000 people within that thing. So it's about 50% of the both communities, and I think it's probably equalized both ways. Mm-hmm. But there were very few Jews in 1978 when I came here. There were 10 to 15,000 Jews in that Boca Del Rey region. Okay.
How is it that you got the job? Did you see it advertised? Did you?
No, I'll tell you. I knew it was, at that time they were not hiring rabbis to be federation directors at all. They were hiring social workers. If you didn't have a social work degree, you didn't know how to run something. Okay, that was their bias. And I knew the job was open. I saw it. And I called a rabbi friend, Joel Levine. He's in West Palm Beach. He's retired now from Temple Judea in West Palm Beach, living in California. And I said, Joel, there's a position as assistant director in charge of the Boca Raton office. And I said, do you know the director up there? Because I want to get an interview, and they're not going to interview me because I'm a rabbi. You know, I'm not a social worker. And he said, not only do I know him, I'm the largest rabbinical contributor. He says, very well. Joel got me the interview. I never would have been interviewed. I came, I got the interview, and I got the job. And then I would go once a week up to for staff meetings in West Palm, but I ran this office. And this quote, this office was nothing. There was one. They had a Helene Eichler, who you interviewed earlier. She was a housewife, college-educated, bright woman, who was looking to do something on the side, and they needed something. They hired her half-time the year before, just to, to do what they have to do. Because they had $250,000 of people who contributed, but no campaign down here. And they decided they needed to create the office. But they had to hire they should have hired her. She was very competent. But again, you always go out of town for the expert. So they hired a director, and I got the job. And so there's the two of us. The Federation was myself and Helene, who was, quote, my secretary. As soon as we grew up a little bit, I got a secretary, and Helene ended up assistant director of the Federation. And from 1978, which we started with a campaign, we inherited a campaign of $250,000 annual. And I left them in 1991 because somebody offered me a job in the newspaper business, all right? That year, we raised $17 million on 3 different lines for the capital campaign, and there was a special campaign for Russian jewelry coming in, and I think we got $8 or $9 million on the regular campaign. We raised $17 million. Helene was the assistant director. She did most of the work. I got most of the glory. It's a shame. Without Helene, there wouldn't be a Jewish community here. Okay. And she stayed on. After I left the job, she stayed on as assistant director until she finally retired and so on. Mm-hmm. So it was a period, and what happened was, I just skipped over something. I apologize. In '78, we started. We had a very good year. We went, I don't know, from 250,000 to I think it was 500 or 600. It was 500,000 or 600,000 that first year. And the lay people here, Jim Bear is a name that will go down in history in this community. He's no longer alive. Otherwise, he was the president he became the first president. He was the leader of the South. And in November 1st, 1979, the local community got together. They had a meeting in Temple Beth El on 4th Avenue, and they voted to secede from the Federation up there. They weren't too happy up there, but they accepted it, okay? And the national organization got in and said, okay, we approve and so on. There was a little tension, but and then the South County Jewish Federation was formed November 1st, 1979. And Jim was the first president. And from there, that's when and the Federation, there's one other important thing. I apologize. I'm a little chaotic. I apologize to those listening. In most ordinary communities, the Federation was founded after all of the organizations were there. The Jewish Community Center, the Family Service, et cetera, et cetera. There was no Jewish community here. So we at the Federation founded everything. That was the joy that I had with Helene's help and a staff. Eventually, there was a very large staff. I mean, you don't raise that kind of money with no staff. But we founded all of the things. We said, we need a Jewish family service. You get a Jewish family service. We need a Jewish community center. We founded a Jewish community center. We need a day school. We founded what is today the Donna Klein Jewish Academy. We founded in 1980, I believe it was. I mean, there were 33 kids in that school when we started it, of which 3 were Warshal kids, my kids. All right, and with mixed classes, and we rented 2 classrooms in Temple Bethel. That's where we started. And now it's over 700 kids from K through 12 in a magnificent building out west. Well, that's the other thing. We finally built our campus. So I was around. I built it. I left just when we moved into the campus in 1991. So that the Federation here predated the community. The Federation created the community. And then later on, when I left, we still owned all of them. In other words, all of the directors of those agencies answered to the CEO of the Federation. That was my position. And then later on, they all were spun off and they're independent, but they still get money from the Federation to support them as other communities. But this community was founded backwards, Federation first and all of the institutions. And then we founded one other, JARC, Jewish Association for Residential Care for developmentally disabled adults. And there's now homes. We started with 1 home. I'd lost track. I mean, I don't know how many homes there are, 8, 10 homes. And independent living.
I think there's 8. I think there's 8.
8. There's 8, and independent living. I'm on their honorary board. I'm not there monthly to the meetings, so I lose track sometimes. And an independent apartment living for them. It's just an amazing organization, and that was founded by the Federation. And it was spun off again.
I don't understand, if there were no Jews in Boca Raton, as you said, why did they even put the office there?
Well, there were 10 to 15,000, and the reason they put the office there, I mean, not compared to what there are now, because they put the office there primarily for monetary reasons, because there were Jews who voluntarily gave to their closest federation, which was in West Palm, and they had $250,000 of income. So somebody said, without a real campaign down there, if we put an office down there, you know what? Maybe we can build it up. It was an investment. I think the people who made that decision in West Palm Beach had absolutely no interest in building a Jewish community in Boca Raton. That wasn't their motivation. And that's the reason it was important we had a separate federation. Because once you had a separate federation, you're building for yourself. Because the money went to Israel, but money was also kept back, which we used to build this community.
I guess the West Palm was too far away, really.
It's a different community. It's socially a different community. And that's very, very important. A federation in New York City, for instance, raises its money not through social units, but through business units. They have a campaign for Wall Street. They have a campaign for the rag business. They have a campaign for different sources of industry, of commerce and industry. We, in here, in the South and in many smaller communities, you have a campaign based on social contacts. You have a campaign, for instance, in Boca, you would have a Boca campaign. You have oh, okay. That's all right. Cough and enjoy yourself. Okay. You have a campaign based on social contacts. And there wasn't a great amount, even to today, of social contacts between Boca. They're 2 different communities. It's the difference between Akron and Cleveland. It's about the same distance. But nobody in Akron has an identity. You say, where are you from? They don't say, I'm from Cleveland. They say, I'm from Akron. So the people down here didn't say, I'm from Palm Beach. It was a totally different, and in charity, all kinds of charity, having nothing to do with Jewish charities, having to do with all kinds. People give to people, not necessarily to charity. They give to charities, but there's so many charities out there, you can't give to them all, unless you happen to be gay, Bill Gates or somebody. And therefore, you give to charities. When a friend says, I'm very active in the Heart Association, we're really trying to raise money, I said, sure, I'll give to the Heart Association. It may not have been my first choice, but if my friend is interested, I'll give. Because I'm going to give tzedakah anyhow. Tzedakah is a fancy word. It doesn't translate to charity, but we'll just say it does. So I'm going to give anyhow. But people give primarily to the charities that their friends are involved in as a form of friendship, if they believe in it. If somebody comes up to me and say, I want you to give charity to this, and I just don't believe it, I'll say, you know something, you're a great guy, but it's just not my charity. So therefore, they could never, the community would never have been built down here if they stayed part of this federation up there, because the social contacts are so different. And when they got the money, they didn't reinvest it down here. They reinvested in their own community up there. So that's how it started.
Who decided what Boca Raton and Delray Beach, Boca Raton in particular, needed? Was that you? Did you envision that it needed a day school, that it needed a JCC, that it needed a family service?
Helene and I and a couple other lay people. That's another thing. It's very, very important. No matter how good your professional staff is, nothing will get done unless you have very good lay people. And we happen to have had fantastic lay people. Now, the reverse is also true. You can have fantastic lay people, but if you have a lousy staff, nothing's still going to get done. The lay people don't have time to do it. They're on the board, they envision it, but they have their own businesses to run. They have their own lives to lead. And we had, it's not nice to say, we had a good professional leadership, but we had fantastic lay leadership. Jim Baer and Jim Noble and Marianne Bobick and Marvin Zale, great, he was one of my presidents, great guy, still around, thank God.
There's so many things named after him now.
Yeah, I mean, but those were great lay people. And even we talked about JARC, the Association for Jewish Residential Care, Mel Clayman, who had a developmentally disabled child, and it was his interest, came into the office and said, you know, we need this. And Helene and I looked at him and said, let's go. So some of the ideas came from the lay people. It was his thing, but we did it together. We started it. And he was involved in it. He was president for many years and so on. But you have to have the combination of both. That's very, very important. But yeah, it came out of our office. With our office meaning the lay people and our organization. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about how JARC started.
Well, we made a choice. When Mel came in and said that, an idea, and it's great, and they said, this is what I mean, getting things done. We went to the board. We had a big board, 30, 40 people and so on. The executive committee is much smaller. And we wanted to say, let's invest in this. And like all boards, they said, well, we have to have a study done, whether we have the need or not. Now, I knew by that time that the need was here. And the study would have been another 1 year. We'd go to the FAU and get somebody to do the study, and then we'd have to ponder it. And so I found out that they had just opened up a group home for developmentally disabled adults in Dallas, Texas. So I called them up and I said, you had a study done? They said, of course you have to have a study done. I said, good, send it to me. I got the study, and in the study it said very clearly that 1% of a Jewish population, given the demographics and the education, because it changes based on what percentage, from whether you're an uneducated community and so on, because they catch it. The figure is not true for all segments of the population. And it said 1% of Jewish communities have a developmentally disabled adult or child. I said, good, here's our population here. Take 1%. I went to the board, I said, this is how many we have in the community. We're not going to be any different than any other Jewish community. You don't need a new study. They said, let's go. So we fast-tracked it. That's when I talk about being able to have good administration as well as good lay people. And then we made some decisions. If we're going to build the first home, which we built, and we want that home to be as nice as any Jewish home, as nice as any home in Del Air or or any of the other communities that existed at that time. Did not exist, St. Andrews, but in Boca West, or in any, we wanted it to be a beautiful home. And that's exactly what we did. And we went to Dick Siemens, who was a developer, he was a great Jewish leader. The Siemens Jewish campus is named after him. He donated all the land out there, right? And we said, Dick, but he's a builder. And he says, my people will do it for nothing, no profit. Yeah. So that's a savings like mad. And we built a gorgeous home, and a home that if you walked into or I walked into, I'd be glad to live in. We just didn't throw people into an old home. It was good. We built it from scratch, and that's been this organization from the very beginning we hired a full-time resident for the home, a mother, for the home, and that's been the feeling of this organization. Everything is done first class because these people should have the same lifestyle as everybody else in the community. Being developmentally disabled doesn't mean you're a second-rate citizen.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
Boca Raton is a very affluent community, and yet you decided you needed a Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services
Yes.
for social welfare. Were there that many people who needed charity, who needed social services, who needed...
Oh, let me tell you. Boca Raton is a very, very affluent community. It's also a very poor community, except you don't see it. Okay? I mean, believe me, if we have 135,000 Jews in Boca and Del Rey, because that whatever it is, or Boca Raton, half of that, let's say, I assure you a very good percentage of that are people that are just getting by. And I remember this very clearly. I got 2 phone calls in 1 week. My secretary at the time called and said, Bruce, there's a Jewish woman on the phone that she's out of money. She's a single parent, and she has one or two children, whatever it is, and she doesn't even have enough money for the food. I said, let's get her over to the Jewish Family Service. She'll be taken care of, right? And then later on in the week, I get a phone call, again from my secretary, buzzes in. I have a woman on the phone to call the Federation. I don't know why they call the Federation, by the way, because you should go directly to the Family Service, but we get stray calls all over. They just look for Jewish in the phone book. And she says, I have a woman who has a child, I don't remember, it could have been 2 children, who she's out, she doesn't have money to buy new diapers for her children. I mean, that's how, I said, we just got that phone call. And she said, no, this is a different one. I mean, there are people in need in this community. They're elderly. The elderly come down here, they have a given amount of money, and then sickness happens in the family. One sickness wipes everybody out. Or they just run out of money. They're now 15 years older than when they came, and they need help. And then there are people who are middle-class people. With kids, they're raising kids. They don't need handouts. They feed themselves and so on, but they have a psychological problem. They can't afford to go to a private psychologist at $150 an hour, even once a week. They can't afford that. They have a family to raise. But you go to the Jewish Family Service, and it's a sliding scale. You have to pay something, $5, $10, $15, or whatever the scale is. So you need these organizations. We're not all multimillionaires down here, trust me. That's an image of the Jewish community, so all those rich people. Well, we have a lot of poor people too, or middle-class people just struggling.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with us today. We hope to continue this at a later date. And it was a great pleasure talking to you, Rabbi Warshal.
It was a pleasure talking to you. I'm sorry we talk so much, but it's your fault. Thank you.